This month, Steve Bannon called for a three-state solution in Israel, with the third state being a Christian nation in control of Jerusalem. If you're going to have a two-state solution, you have to have a three-state solution, Bannon said on his podcast. And one of those states has to be the Christian state of Jerusalem. Already in 2019, Bannon argued that the only way to guarantee the welfare of Israel, and of American Jews for that matter, was what he called a hard weld with Christian nationalism. The future of American Jews, he said, was conditional upon that one thing. Now, Bannon is arguing for a Christian state in Israel. He claims that if you really want to protect the Holy Land, the Christians are going to have to get their own stake in this. Bannon considers himself a Christian nationalist, and he's not alone. Christian nationalism is widespread on the far right. It buoyed Donald Trump's third run for president, especially after he survived an assassination attempt in Butler, Pennsylvania in July 2024, which many on the right saw as the hand of God. Naturally, Trump played along and encouraged those beliefs, telling a crowd that many people have told me that God spared my life for a reason, and that reason was to save our country and to restore America to greatness. Today, a large number of MAGA supporters view Trump as a messianic figure. Now, this is part of a broader religiosity on the American right. Even among less extreme evangelicals, Christianity plays an important role on the far right. 44% of Republicans, for instance, believe that President Trump's election in 2024 was part of God's overall plan. Christian faith is deep on the right. The worldview of the Heritage Foundation, as I've demonstrated in another talk, the leading far-right think tank, is grounded on Christian faith. The very conception of liberty at the heart of the Heritage vision and its Project 2025 mandate for leadership revolves around Christian beliefs. They conceive of freedom as fulfilling God's intentions for us as human beings. It's tied to our divine essence as human beings, which consists of matrimonial relations between a man and a wife, procreation, and raising a traditional family. Liberty is understood as a form of blessedness. Being free is giving full expression to our divine nature. As Kevin Roberts, the president of the Heritage Foundation, explains, our Constitution grants each of us the freedom to do not what we want, but what we ought to. Even secular right thinkers are turning to Christian faith. Just this month, Charles Murray, a conservative thinker, published an autobiographical account of his own intellectual conversion to Christianity. In his new book, Taking Religion Seriously, Murray charts his own agnostic intellectual struggles with religion and ultimately his newfound Christian faith. This is a story precisely of the welding of conservatism and Christianity. Now, all of this raises a question. Does Christian belief lean right? Is Christianity tied to conservatism? The question has been a source of contentious debate for centuries, and I hesitate to wade into that debate in only a short presentation. But what is certain is that historically, Christian faith has nourished leftist politics as well as the far right. And it's nourished leftist politics from liberation theology and sanctuary church movements, all the way to forms of Christian Marxism. Of course, this is true of other religious faiths as well, other religions and religious traditions. You need only think here of the Nation of Islam and the trajectory of Malcolm X. But what's clear is that Christianity and Christian faith has also nourished the left. In the United States today, the evidence indicates that Christian faith among white adults correlates with membership in the Republican Party, but that Christian faith among black adults correlates with membership in the Democratic Party. So what's clear, even today, is that Christianity can lead believers into very different political directions. Now this then raises perhaps an even more interesting question. How is it possible that Christian faith could nourish the far right when the same religious tradition has given birth to liberation theology, sanctuary church movement, and forms of Christian Marxism? What does that say about Christian faith? Is it just empty words that can lead in any political direction whatsoever? Is there any necessity between Christian faith and concrete political views or outcomes? And if not, well, should religion just stay out of politics? How can one reconcile the position of the Heritage Foundation or the Christian nationalism of Steve Bannon with the fact that so many thinkers of Christian faith hold diametrically opposite views? Like my brilliant and dear colleague, Thomas Anthony Durkin, who passed away just a few months ago, but who was convinced and who wouldn't ever avoid an opportunity to argue that the early Christian fathers were effectively communists. Now, to address this question, I propose examining here the writings of a brilliant philosopher who attempted to bridge Christian faith with left politics, and also who self-consciously addressed the question of whether there is a necessary link between the form and the content, between the belief systems and the political positions, between theory and practice. The French philosopher Louis Althusser dedicated his early years to reconciling his Christian faith with his leftist beliefs and to interrogating the question of the relationship between form and content. So it makes sense to look more closely into Althusser's philosophical project. And we're going to start, of course, here with the young Louis Althusser. And we may as well begin with his first article titled The International of Decent Feelings, written in the immediate aftermath of the Second World War in 1946. Now, in the article, Althusser proposes a synthesis of Christian faith and leftist political thought. The synthesis operates by means of the concept of destiny, or fate, which Althusser borrows from the young Hegel, more specifically from one of Hegel's earliest writings, his 1799 essay on the spirit of Christianity and its destiny. The title in German is Der Geist des Christentums und sein Schicksal, and the German word Schicksal translates as fate or destiny, or even future, or fortune, or lot. So what we're looking at here is the spirit of Christianity and its fate, its destiny, its future, which was a early text by Hegel. In effect, so the young Althusser, who is almost 29 years old at the time, works with the Christian concept of destiny that he takes from the Christian writings of the 29-year-old Hegel, and he uses it to advance his leftist agenda of revolutionary workers' movements. At the time, Althusser was still more Christian than Marxist, perhaps, although he was trying to synthesize the two seamlessly. Raised Catholic and a devout Catholic in his youth, and also on the far right in his youth, by 1946, Louis Althusser resumes his studies at the École Normale Supérieure at the Rue d'Ulm in Paris, after spending 5 years in a Stalag, a German prisoner of war camp in Schleswig, Germany, as a captured French soldier. He's not yet a member of the French Communist Party, which he will join 2 years later in November 1948. At the time, he's still a practicing Catholic, and he plunges into the youthful writings of Hegel that are all on Christian theology, and that all tie Hegel's religious thought to his political philosophy. Now, all of this may be surprising to those of you who are more familiar with Althusser's mature writings, or with Hegel's mature writings, for that matter. Althusser is better known for the thesis that he developed in the mid-1960s, which identified what he called an epistemological break in the thought of Karl Marx, a discontinuity between the youthful philosophical writings on the one hand and the mature scientific economic writings evidenced in the first volume of Capital on the other hand. Althusser located the break in Marx's thought in 1845, after Marx had dedicated himself to the critique of Hegel's philosophy of right in his notebooks from 1843, and then he had critiqued the phenomenology of spirit in his Paris manuscripts of 1844. So it was in 1845, about the time that he's writing what's called the German ideology, which are his Brussels manuscripts, that Althusser identifies a change, an epistemological change, a different way of viewing the world. And Althusser argued in his most well-known works, for Marx, for instance, or Reading Capital in 1965, that the only way to truly understand and operationalize Marx's thought is to sever and to ignore the political and the philosophical writings of Marx's youth, all of which engaged Hegel's thought. One had to, in effect, excise the young Hegelian philosophical Marx to understand the true scientific Marx. That's what most people retain from Althusser. But what is less well known is that Althusser started his intellectual journey himself as a young Hegelian himself, and a devout Catholic, who deliberately retained his Christian faith in his leftist political worldview by means of lengthy elaborations of Hegel's writings, both the youthful Hegel writings on Christianity and the mature phenomenological and political writings. In effect, Althusser dedicated himself to reconciling Christianity, Marxism, and Hegelianism. And his master's thesis was a lengthy treatment of Hegel's thought, titled On Content in the Thought of G.W.F. Hegel, which in published form is about 200 pages long. But let's start with his first unpublished article, The International of Decent Feelings, from 1946. That article is a critique of liberal and existentialist French philosophers, such as André Malraux, Albert Camus, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Arthur Koestler, who Althusser believed were mounting a false flag operation against the workers' movement. It's a fierce critique. In a letter to his parents, he refers to the draft as quite virulent. He attacks them, these French authors, for co-opting the idea of human fate or destiny towards a centrist or reformist political agenda. What he referred to at the time as humanism, but it was a very kind of middle-of-the-road humanism. Althusser does not aim his venom at the far right or at fascists, but at the moderate, left-wing, centrist liberals who are effectively, on his view, undermining the workers' movement. Althusser's argument, in essence, is that these humanists have created an illusion, namely, that in the immediate post-war moment, the fate of humanity as a whole is at risk. They turned the crises of the post-war moment, the atomic bomb, new technologies, the apocalyptic condition of post-war Europe, into a myth that mankind was facing an existential threat. Mixed with a political pessimism, this myth of a generalized human risk led them to a conciliatory, consensus politics, a soft liberalism that operated hand in hand with capitalism. As Fred Moten explains in an interesting article, Althusser denounces the International of Decent Feelings because it attempts to erase antagonisms that are the necessary precursors of revolutionary theory and practice. Now, by contrast to this humanist myth and its accompanying fear of a human destiny that might end in apocalypse, Althusser recuperates a Christian notion of destiny, wedded to the emancipation of man. He emphasizes that the atomic bomb itself is nothing more than the product of human labor, and draws a parallel between the mythic fear of that human product, the atomic bomb, and the worker's condition of being subjugated by the product of their own work. The path forward, he argues, is to reconcile human beings with their true identity, by which he means workers coming into control of the means of production. I said identity. That's interesting. I meant destiny. It's to reconcile human beings with their true destiny, by which Althusser means their destiny being workers coming into control of the means of production. As he writes in 1946, the road to reconciliation of mankind with their destiny is essentially their appropriation of the products of their labor, of their work in general, and of their history as well. This reconciliation, he continues, presupposes the transition from capitalism to socialism through the liberation of the proletariat workers, who not only through this act can liberate themselves, but also liberate the whole of humanity from its contradiction, and moreover, from the apocalyptic fear that besieges it. It's at this kind of critical juncture of his argument that Hegel appears, but the young Hegel of the spirit of Christianity and its destiny. Althusser inserts a quick note, a short reference to the book, writing, "Destiny is the consciousness of self as an enemy," said Hegel. Althusser's point is that Malraux, Camus, and the humanists express fear for their own destiny in the face of the atomic bomb and apocalyptic war, which haunts the horizon like a specter. In the face of this fear of their fate, they can no longer see their own image in mankind. They no longer recognize themselves. And so, Althusser writes, quoting Hegel, they treat their own destiny as an enemy. They, quote, break the silent bonds that unite them to their destiny and curse it. Now, faced with this mythic threat to the human condition, the reformists protest against a destiny that they feel is escaping them. But in the face of this political pessimism, Althusser posits another conception of destiny that is both Christian and leftist. He argues that we are not all equally situated, that our supposed equality in the face of threat is an illusion, a myth that must be denounced by such, by Christians, he says. He writes, "For we believe, as Christians, in the human condition. In other words, we believe in the equality of all men before God and before his judgment. And we do not want God's judgment to be concealed from us. And we do not want non-Christians, and sometimes Christians, to commit the sacrilege of taking the atomic bomb for the will of God, equality before death for equality before God, and the tortures of concentration camps for the last judgment." No, he argues, we must reject this pessimistic path. As Christians, he says, we must acknowledge that the worker's condition is far different, and we must seize a truly Christian conception of destiny that will lead to solidarity and cooperation. Althusser draws the implications in italics. We await the advent of the human condition and the end of destiny. By which he means, of course, the workers' movement and the passage to socialism will be the start of the human condition, the end of the humanist myth of destiny, and the realization of humanity's true destiny. Of course, that is Hegel's message, according to Althusser. Hegel himself had turned in his youth to Christianity in a Protestant style to resolve the tension he felt in the formalism of Kantian morality and certain religious traditions, especially Judaism, according to the young Hegel. Hegel's idea of destiny involved precisely a reconciliation of reason and passion, of faith and rationality, of desire and duty. Similarly, Althusser's idea of destiny reconciles what is, in effect, the alienation of mankind from their labor, from their work, from their œuvre, from their history. And that's where the essay ends. We're missing a few pages or passages, but the last words, it appears, are the following. In this struggle, we will fight as well against the myths that seek to rob us of the truth. We are hungry for the truth, and we love it like the bread it tastes like. In this struggle, we do not reject good intentions, but we need the will and comrades who are willing to listen and to see. It is not the deaf and the blind who will guide mankind in the friendship of their destiny. Now, this is naturally a very different view of Christianity and its political implications than we find in Steve Bannon's Christian nationalism. It's also very different than the kind of Christianity we hear in the Heritage Foundation. Far more attractive, on my view, even if I do not consider myself a Christian. But it simply raises, again, and does not resolve the original question. If, in fact, Christian faith can lead to Bannon's argument for a Christian nation in Jerusalem, and also to Althusser's call for a workers' revolution and socialism, then are Christian teachings void of any content? Is there a complete divorce of the formal aspects of Christianity, the logics, the language, the epistles, the teachings, and the political substance or content that can be derived from it? Is there, in fact, an alienation of form and substance in Christian faith, one that Hegel himself protested against in his youth and tried to resolve in the spirit of Christianity and its destiny? Now, perhaps Althusser was driven to this very puzzle by the end of his own argument. In any event, though, Althusser turns to this precise question in his first major work, also unpublished during his lifetime, his Diplôme d'études supérieures at the Sorbonne, what was in effect his master's thesis, which he defended in 1947 under the supervision of the French philosopher of science, Gaston Bachelard. And although Althusser plunges deeply in the first part of his thesis into the youthful writings of Hegel on Christianity, Althusser poses the question to the entire Hegelian corpus rather than simply to Christian faith. The central question that Althusser poses is whether the political outcomes of Hegel's writings are the necessary product of the form or the logic of his philosophy, or if instead there's a disjuncture, an alienation of form and substance, and if the latter, whether there's any value to Hegel's thought. In other words, are form and substance, are theory and practice, related. Because if not, we could simply dispense with the form, the logic, the theory, the philosophy, or the religion, and simply fight over politics. So the question Althusser poses in his thesis is the following. How is it possible that the same Hegelian dialectic, the same intellectual form, the same language, the same logic, could have given rise, 10 years after Hegel's death, to both a right-wing Hegelianism and to its opposite, the left or young Hegelians, including Marx and Engels? Or, turning to his own present in 1947, how is it possible that Hegelian thought could nourish humanist existentialists such as Jean-Paul Sartre, moderate or reformist humanists such as André Malraux or Jean Hippolyte, dogmatic or deterministic Marxists, and a whole range of phenomenologists? How could such disparate thinkers all feed at the trough of Hegelianism? And of course, the same question could be asked of Christianity. Should we therefore free ourselves from the form of thought or from its political content? Now, to bring us back to our crises and problematics of today, for we face the same dilemma today, we could ask ourselves similarly, how is it possible in the United States that the same religious faith, most often Christianity, but it's true of other religious faiths, can serve as a basis for conservative or reactionary, even counter-revolutionary far-right politics, but also for progressive movements? How could it nourish both the Heritage Foundation and the Sanctuary Church movement? Althusser tackles this question, this exact question, by interrogating the, quote, content of Hegel's thought. That's the very title of the master's thesis, Content in the Thought of G.W.F. Hegel. Now, what does content mean? For Althusser, the concept of content is opposed to that of form, by which he means the Hegelian dialectic, the logical form of the dialectic, dialectical reasoning. So the question Althusser asks in his thesis is whether it's possible to separate form and content. And the question arises, of course, again, because immediately after his death, after Hegel's death, there arose both a right-wing and a left-wing version of Hegelianism. We're all familiar with the left-wing young Hegelians who, in a way, survived in history. Ludwig Feuerbach, Bruno Bauer, Max Stirner, of course the young Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, who would later break away from the young Hegelians and become more radical. We hardly read the right-wing Hegelians today, hardly remember their names, but some of them include Heinrich Leo, Leopold von Henning, Johann Philipp Gabler, Hermann Hinrichs, Karl Daub, thinkers few people have probably heard of today. As Althusser writes, the lesson of history is unequivocal. Hegel himself became the decomposition of Hegel. 10 years after the master's death, his work fell apart, divided, developed in opposing directions, became the site of a struggle, and was itself a struggle. Ich bin der Kampf. I am the struggle. Hegel's thought immediately became alienated, fractured, split in two diametrically opposed political directions. And that, of course, is a great paradox. A philosophy that synthesized, a philosophy that would lead to an absolute summit, absolute knowledge, a philosophy that prided itself on reconciliation, unification, unity, overcoming of contradictions, a system that led us really to the summit of knowledge, of self-consciousness, of our own awareness of ourselves as containing all previous philosophical material stages, very much a philosophy like Christianity, which of course explains why Hegel's absolute spirit is often interpreted in a religious way. This kind of unified philosophy suddenly finds itself right after Hegel's death pulled in opposite political directions. It's quite remarkable. So, Althusser asks himself, how is it possible that the same work, the same logic, the same dialectic could give birth to two opposite political contexts? Of course, another way of asking this question, is there a direction or a necessity to the Hegelian dialectic, or is the form of the dialectic just indeterminate? And these are, of course, I'm sure you realize, questions that critical thinkers have asked themselves throughout the ages, about the form of criticism itself, whether it's true in critical theory or in Christianity. It's, for instance, at the heart of Duncan Kennedy's landmark article, Form and Substance in Private Law Adjudication, Form and Substance, right, in Private Law Adjudications, which contributed to the birth of critical legal studies in the 1970s. These are long-standing issues for thinkers of all stripes, since it affects so many different areas. So Althusser formulates the question precisely in these words, quote, whether dialectics is a form imposed from outside, or whether it is the development of content, whether it is formal or real, whether the schema is a purely mechanical process or the soul of things. And he offers a response in three parts. To answer these questions, Althusser turns to an imminent examination of Hegel's thought. He burrows inside it. He seeks the answer in Hegel's thought, not outside it. He takes the approach somewhat like the critical theory approach of the Frankfurt School, to enter, or in his words, he writes, to penetrate inside the truth. And as he writes, perhaps then it will be possible to determine whether Hegelianism is indeed a philosophy of the content or a superficial formalism, and to resolve the paradox of the most rigorous systems justifying the least rigorous of institutions, and ultimately breaking down as if its rigor were borrowed. Althusser tackles the question in a first part entitled Birth of the Concept by returning to the young Hegel, particularly the spirit of Christianity and its destiny. He demonstrates that this problematic of formalism versus content is something that Hegel himself had directly confronted in his youth in dealing with Christianity. For Hegel, the problem stemmed from a feeling of emptiness faced with Enlightenment philosophy and its emphasis on reason. Hegel shared this feeling of emptiness. He shared this feeling of emptiness with other German romantics, such as Friedrich Schiller, a sense that, obligation and reason alone are not enough to move us as human beings, that something more is needed, like will or spirit or passion. As Althusser writes, in this world emptied of its truth, the young Hegel and his friends from Tübingen, Hölderlin, and Schelling aspired to a regained fullness. Here, too, one can sense an element of alienation between beliefs and duties, between thought and action, between knowing and doing. A sense of alienation that Hegel associates with Immanuel Kant. As Althusser writes, Kant is the philosopher for Hegel who wants to learn to swim in order to jump into the water. The problem with Kantian morality is that we are forced to act because of the categorical imperative instead of acting according to our desires and ethics. And what Althusser is reaching for with Hegel is a reconciliation of these forms of alienation, of separation, in effect, a unity of form and substance. In a second part, titled Knowledge of the Concept, Althusser tackles Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit and Encyclopedia of the Philosophical Sciences, which are the more mature writings. Althusser performs a dialectical analysis on the concept of content, in effect a three-step movement where the third movement, the most important one, becomes the self-consciousness of the content in history. The discussion is abstract, but taking the example of a specific content, say citizenship, can offer a more concrete understanding. So let's take the example of citizens who recognize each other as equals and not as master and slave. According to Althusser, Hegel argues that the concept of citizenship cannot simply be understood if it is taken as a given, if it is taken for granted. Nor can it be understood through mere reflection. Instead, it must be understood through a historical process, through the experience, for instance, of the French Revolution, through the actualization of the content in history and through historical experience. This, of course, can remind you, or might remind you, of the end of the phenomenology of spirit, which leaves the reader in the aftermath of the French Revolution and the Terror in a rational and fulfilled world of equal citizenship. But this is where things become problematic for Althusser, because that's not the world that Hegel describes and defends in his work, Principles of the Philosophy of Law, what we generally call the philosophy of right, 14 years later in 1820. Instead of equal citizenship in the wake of the French Revolution, the content becomes that of a hereditary constitutional monarchy, which represents a hierarchy, a pyramidal structure, the very opposite of Hegel's dialectical circle. It leads to an authoritarian Prussian bureaucracy where there's no place for equality, but rather inequality and hierarchy, where there is no room for freedom, but rather, as Althusser writes, the bulkheads of corporations, bureaus, and police forces. Here, Althusser pens one of the best lines in his work. The reason of the state is nothing more than reason of state, a reason of another world hiding the unreason of this world. There's another great line. He writes, "The individual does not find his fulfillment and liberation in the state, but rather the official recognition of his servitude and alienation." And that sense of alienation also attaches on the other side, on the monarch, who himself is split in two, with on the one hand his individuality as a human being, and on the other hand the crown, which reminds us, of course, of Kantorowicz's brilliant work on the king's two bodies. Now, it's at this point, in a third part of the thesis titled Misunderstanding of the Concept, that Althusser initiates a series of operations on Hegel's thought that can be described as inversions or cyclical turnings. First, Althusser draws on Marx's 1843 manuscripts, Contribution to the Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, to identify a distortion in Hegel's political analysis. And on that basis, Althusser effectuates an epistemological break, avant la lettre, within Hegel's writings. Now, in 1843, Marx had critiqued Hegel for not following through on the implications of his philosophy for politics. As noted, instead of leading towards equal citizenship in a democratic setting, Hegel promotes a hierarchical political system of constitutional monarchy in his Philosophy of Right in 1820. Marx's critique serves the role for Althusser of identifying Hegel's misstep, or the perversion of the political content. And remarkably, in this context, Althusser uses the term error and falsity, harsh terms for a young philosopher. Marx's critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right demonstrates that Hegel left the reader in a form of alienation between, on the one hand, the private selfish interests of the middle class in society, and on the other hand, the universal interests of the state. Marx argued instead for resolution through true democracy, where he believed Hegel had ended in his earlier work written in Jena in 1806 in The Phenomenology of Spirit, just as Napoleon was taking control of the city. Althusser diagnoses the problem as the product of an unfortunate epistemological or political break in the writings of Hegel. And I said avant la lettre earlier because Althusser has not yet developed his most famous thesis, which he would in the mid-1960s about the epistemological break in Marx, right? Here, Althusser does not even mention the notion of epistemological breaks, but the idea is subliminally present in the text. Althusser draws a line between the early Hegel of the Phenomenology of Spirit in 1806 and the Hegel of the Philosophy of Right in 1820. He effectively urges us to abandon the later Hegel. He tries to sever the conservative political thought of the Philosophy of Right and leave us only with the revolutionary historical development from the Phenomenology of Spirit. The break is reflected clearly, in my view, when he refers to the later works as the unfortunate texts of the Philosophy of Right and the Philosophy of History. In his words, les malheureux textes. Now, Second inversion. For Althusser, however, the problem he and Marx identify in Hegel represents just a moment in the Hegelian dialectic. It's therefore necessary as a moment in the dialectic and can be overcome by continuing the dialectical reasoning. The problem is that Hegel remained in 1820 at too abstract a level. And that abstraction is precisely what the Hegelian dialectic overcomes. So in effect, the form of alienation that remains in the late Hegel, in the philosophy of right in 1820, between the egotistical interests of the middle class and the universal interests of the state, can be resolved by prolonging Hegel's work, the work of the dialectic, the process that Hegel describes in his works on logic. Both the Science of Logic from 1812-1816 and the Logic, which forms part 1 of the Encyclopedia in 1817. In effect, Hegel's political content in 1820 is distorted, but the error represents an essential contradiction, and it can be overcome using the logical process that Hegel calls his dialectic. And interestingly, Althusser argues here, so this is the second reversal, that Marx was too dismissive of Hegel and did not recognize that Hegel's own internal logic provided the way forward. In fact, Althusser suggests Hegel realized an essential point that Marx himself overlooked or ignored. In French, he writes, que Marx néglige. Marx serves as a corrective, but he must then be augmented by Hegel's own logic and Hegel's work on the concept, which Hegel elaborates in his two logics. Or to be more precise, Hegelian logic and method are needed to complement Marx's critique of Hegel's political thought, which corrects it, puts it on the right path, but which requires a return to Hegelian thought to accomplish that with necessity. You will recall that Marx had pointedly remarked in his critiques of Hegel's philosophy of right that Hegel's true interest in that work was not politics, but logic, that the political work was just the unrolling of his logic. He famously wrote, "It's not the philosophy of law, but rather the logic that constitutes the true center of interest in the philosophy of right. What is philosophical in all this is not the logic of the matter, but the matter of the logic. It is not the logic that serves to demonstrate the state, it is the state that serves to demonstrate the logic." In effect, Marx argued that Hegel got lost in abstractions, that he got distracted trying to realize the actual. But at that point, Althusser argues, Hegel's own logic becomes crucial to continuing Marx's and Engels and Hegel's work. Hegel stopped at the level of abstraction, but as Althusser writes, abstraction is only the locus of Hegelian alienation. Hegel can lead us out of the abstractions, and this reflects, in Hegel's words in 1947, which may surprise you, the greatness of Hegel. Now, in a third and final moment at the end of the thesis, Althusser returns to Marx to give texture to Hegel's political content, which we know in the phenomenology of spirit ends in a revolutionary manner. Hegel provides the logical path forward. As Althusser writes, we owe this conception of history as fundamental element and meaningful totality to Hegel. We also owe Hegel the ability to identify the rational nature of this totality with the nature of human totality. But to truly understand where it all leaves us, at the final revolutionary moment of the dialectic, we need to bring back Marx. We need to turn to Marx and to his interpretation in Capital of the economic basis of this human totality. Ultimately, the final resolution of Hegel's political thought is achieved in the revolutionary action of the workers' movement. Althusser writes, revolutionary action can conceive, at least formally, the advent of human totality reconciled with its own structure. And he concludes with these words, "The future lies for us In the secret movements of the present content, we remain in a totality that is still obscure totality and that we must bring to light. Althusser does not view these three different moments as inversions of Hegel, actually. He rejects Marx's well-known idea of putting Hegel back on his feet. He suggests that the idea of turning Hegel on his head, made famous by Marx, makes little sense because Hegel's thought is circular, right? It's not vertical. It's a circle, and that one can't turn a circle on its head. Althusser asks, what could a circularity put back on its feet really amount to? So the idea of inversion or reversal is not the right way to think about the relationship between these thinkers, Althusser suggests. Marx did not simply turn Hegel on his head and transform idealism into materialism. Rather, the circular logic of dialectical movement must continue. And that is precisely what Althusser proposes, the continuation of the logic of historical transformation that leads beyond the revolutionary form, which is at the end of the phenomenology of spirit, towards a new revolutionary movement led by workers. Now, what are the stakes here? I mean, at the end of the work, Althusser really returns to the political stakes at issue in this matter. He explains the seriousness of the problem, what he calls the fundamental problem of our time. And the fundamental problem is that practically all the different philosophical and political positions in his contemporary moment constitute mere fragments or crumbs of Hegelian philosophy. And we might here think, again, of our original analogy to Christian faith. All of the political factions simply take up pieces, portions, or splinters, and not the totality of Hegelian thought. Modern existentialists, such as Jean-Paul Sartre, appropriate the subjective element, the subjectivity, the will of the individual. Determinist Marxists, on the other hand, appropriate the objective elements, the structures. Contemporary phenomenologists of different stripes return to the experiential elements. As Althusser writes, contemporary thought was formed in the decay of Hegel and feeds off it. Ideologically speaking, we are thus under the domination of Hegel. And those political factions are stuck in this scattering of Hegel. The way forward, Althusser argues, is to unfold Hegel's dialectical reason properly and actualize it in the real world of the workers' movements and revolutionary actions, to reconcile theory and practice. Now, 3 years later, in 1950, Althusser would actually begin his own break with Hegel in an article entitled Return to Hegel, Last Word of Academic Revisionism. That article from 1950, by contrast to the earlier two works that I was discussing, was published, and it was published in La Nouvelle Critique. And there, so 3 years later, Althusser does make a violent break from Hegel, from his university peers as well, and from the entire tradition of mainstream French philosophy. The article takes aim at the French establishment of university philosophy professors who have turned to Hegel's philosophy, especially the philosopher Jean Hippolyte, who had reintroduced Hegel's work to the French Academy with his French translation starting in 1939 of Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, and his publication in 1948 of a treatise on the text titled Genesis and Structure of the Phenomenology of Spirit of Hegel. Now, at this point in 1950, what motivates, or the puzzle that motivates Althusser, is why French philosophy, which had been so very hostile to Hegel throughout the 19th century, suddenly adopted him in about 1932 at the dawn of the 20th century. In his words, how can we understand this reversal? Althusser's answer is basically that you can understand it for the same reasons that Hegel was adopted by the Prussian elite in the 19th century. Hegel served Prussian feudalism in its efforts to repress and crush the merchant class, what he calls the bourgeoisie, that was rising up in the 19th century in Germany. In the same way, Hegel's writings, particularly on the state, served the elites in 1950 to crush and repress the rising working class. So it's the same gamble, the same ambition, as he says, to place in servitude the rising class. Of course, in the 19th century, it was the merchant class, the bourgeoisie. In the 20th century, it's the working class, what he calls the proletariat. Althusser targets thinkers like Raymond Aron, Hippolyte, and their cohorts, accusing them of acting like Mussolini and other fascists across Europe who used Hegelian thought to repress the working class. The article is brutal, it's violent. Althusser is talking about fascism and Prussian authoritarianism and equates French philosophers with them. He's attacking what he calls a fascist operation. In his words, this great return to Hegel is nothing more than a desperate recourse against Marx in the specific form that revisionism takes in the final crisis of imperialism, a revisionism of a fascist character. Althusser is essentially suggesting that the whole operation of recuperating Hegel in French philosophy is aimed at violence and war against the working classes. It reflects a shift towards a conflictual vision of society based heavily on Hegel's dialectic of the confrontation between lord and bondsman, or what was referred to in French at the time as the master-slave dialectic. Of course, the master-slave dialectic was at the heart of French philosophy at the time, especially in the book of Alexandre Kojève, Introduction to the Readings of Hegel, which was published in 1848, 2 years earlier, based on lectures he had delivered in the 1930s. So in this 1950 article, Althusser proposes a brilliant historical account of the trajectory of French philosophy from the 18th century to the post-war period, one that I will have to come back to in another essay. There's too much to say. But what is clear from this fierce article in 1950, as well as from the equally virulent, in his words, essay from 1946, is that this will not be the final stage of Althusser's reflections on Hegel. No, in fact, we are faced here with the inevitability of Hegel's central place in Althusser's thinking throughout his entire life. Hegel will be his constant foil, and this will lead in the mid-1960s for Marx to that epistemological break which I discussed earlier, which attempted to eliminate entirely any possible reference to Hegel in the interpretation of Marx, accompanied, of course, by a severe critique of Hegel, and then followed in the late 1960s and early 1970s by several texts of fundamental importance on Hegel, Marx, and Lenin that function as an autocritique of sorts of some of his positions from the mid-1960s. Now, Althusser's answer. He managed to reconcile the Christian writings of the young Hegel with Hegel's mature writings in the Phenomenology and the Two Logics, as well as with Marx's early critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, and ultimately with Marx's economic writings from the first volume of Capital. Althusser wove together seamlessly Christianity, the Hegelian dialectic, and Marxism. And in the process, Althusser provided an argument for a necessary relationship between form and content, for a link that inextricably ties together the dialectical logic with the resulting political substance, the politics. Althusser unified theory and practice. Now, to be sure, one can critique Althusser's work, try to find gaps in the reasoning, pull it apart, as one can any philosophical or theological work. This is true of all great works in philosophy and religion. One can find contradictions in even the most rationalist of thinkers, like Kant or Descartes. What matters here, though, is that in answer to the original question, namely, how is it possible that Christian belief or Hegelian philosophy could spawn both right-wing and left-wing politics, Althusser does not back down. He does not concede that form could be disconnected from content. He does not retreat to a purely political argumentation. No, on the contrary, he dedicates himself to proving that the logic, the language, the formality of philosophy necessarily implicates a unique political outcome. Throughout his life, Althusser dedicated himself to the arduous intellectual task of providing a deep philosophical foundation to Marx. That was his life ambition, to develop the theoretical groundwork for Marxism. And that explains why he had such an influence on the left during the second half of the 20th century. And he did it, at first, by trying to reconcile Christian faith with Marxism. Now, where does that leave us? Well, I'd say that today it feels as if only the far right really has a coherent vision of philosophy and a clear policy direction. One may not like them. One may believe they are filled with paradoxes and hypocrisies. But the far right has a coherent worldview. For the Heritage Foundation, it's based on Christian belief. For Steve Bannon, on Christian nationalism. For someone like Christopher Rufo, on an explicit counter-revolutionary perspective. These are all comprehensive worldviews. And one of the reasons that the far right is ascendant today is precisely because they have a comprehensive philosophy. That's the wind in their sails. It empowers people to rally behind them. Now, the left had coherent and articulable worldviews in earlier times. FDR heralded a New Deal in the United States, hand in hand with a robust philosophy about the need for a second Bill of Rights focused on economic and social rights. Building on that, Lyndon B. Johnson gave Americans the idea of the Great Society, a society that would provide for greater economic equality, less racial discrimination, and improved education. Johnson launched the War on Poverty, a whole set of public policy programs intended to reduce poverty for all Americans across the country. Fannie Lou Hamer, the Reverend Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, Thurgood Marshall, Bayard Rustin, and so many others fueled a civil rights movement for racial equality built on a philosophy of nonviolent civil disobedience, not that different from Gandhi. All of these movements offered Americans a vision of a more just society. They inspired people to act. In Europe, one particular coherent philosophy, Marxism, played a much larger role and fueled mass movements and parties throughout the 20th century. In France, for instance, the French Communist Party consistently won over 20% of first-round elections in the National Assembly from the post-war period until around 1978. Today, though, it feels as if the American left has run out of ideas and has no coherent philosophy. Or it has ideas and policies, but no coherent framework to put them in. Bernie Sanders presents as a democratic socialist, as does AOC, but they do not espouse or spend that much time developing the philosophical bases of their worldviews. They're more policy-oriented and issue-driven than philosophical. Zoran Mamdani has a host of innovative public policies centered around the goal of making New York City more affordable. He's proposing a cap on rent increases for rent-stabilized apartments, as Bill de Blasio had done before, free public transportation on buses, a city-run, city-owned wholesale food grocery store in each borough, more affordable housing with up to 200,000 new units over the next decade, barring ICE from city facilities, baby baskets of goods to new parents, and free child care, community responders to mental health crisis 9/11 calls, and violence interrupters. These are a remarkable set of policies, and Mamdani's policy orientation is strategically wise in our political climate. The central organizing principle of Mamdani's worldview is making New York City affordable and less of a struggle for its residents. That's a good message and far more coherent than the other candidates, whether it was Andrew Cuomo, Curtis Sliwa, or the earlier crew, including Eric Adams, who nobody could associate with a single policy strategy. But these are not ambitious, comprehensive philosophical worldviews, by contrast to Christian nationalism on the far right. And I fear that this is handicapping the left right now. One of the most urgent lessons I draw from all this, including Louis Althusser's life ambition to provide a philosophical grounding to the left, is that we need to develop a new comprehensive philosophy for the left. Fred Moten notes that, quote, Althusser appeals to a kind of Christian truth to which I cannot appeal. Nevertheless, a discourse of truth is available to us, the simple, banal, inexhaustible record of what we do and of our motives for doing it. Now, I'm afraid that I, too, cannot appeal to Christian truth, and I hesitate as well to avail myself of Moton's discourse of truth, which, in my opinion, President Donald Trump has appropriated, exploited, and broken. But I would say it is time now to invent a new philosophical path forward, an ambitious philosophical path forward for the left. Thank you.